Hey everyone, welcome back to You Talk. We Listen, where we take one listener's curiosity and turn it into a deep dive of knowledge.
That's right, just for you.
Exactly. And this deep dive is brought to you by the OtisWho network, where you can always find something that makes you go like, wait, hold on. I need to tell someone about this.
The best kind of deep dives, right?
Absolutely. Okay, so for today's deep dive, you sent us some material on Dr. Janette Nesheiwat.
President-elect Trump's nominee for Surgeon General.
Right. And there's a story from her past that adds a whole other layer to this nomination.
Definitely a story that makes you stop and think about her potential role.
It involves a fatal accidental shooting when Nesheiwat was just 13 years old.
Really adds a different dimension to her potential role.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to unpack today, this incident, its connection to her career path, and what it might mean for her potential role as Surgeon General.
This is a fascinating intersection of personal experience and public policy, and one that deserves careful consideration for sure.
So let's start with the incident itself. We're talking 1997.
Nesheiwat is at home in Florida.
According to police records obtained by the New York Times, she was looking for a pair of scissors early one morning.
Seems innocent enough.
The scissors were in a tackle box on a shelf above her father's bed, and in reaching for them, she accidentally knocked the box over, and a .38 Ivory caliber handgun fell out.
Oh, wow. This is where it takes a turn.
Tragically, the gun discharged her father. A 44-year-old chemist was shot in the head while he slept.
Oh, gosh.
She died the next day in a hospital in Orlando.
It's just hard to imagine what that must have been like for her.
At that age, yeah.
Yeah.
The police classified it as a freak accident, and Nesheiwat's account to the police at the time aligns with that it was unintentional.
She describes it as something fell, there was a loud noise, and then I saw blood.
Just heartbreaking.
Yeah, and this is where the story gets even more complex. Nesheiwat has often spoken about this incident as a driving force behind her decision to become a doctor. It's a really powerful example of how personal tragedy can lead to a commitment to helping others.
But there's a discrepancy in how she's discussed it publicly in her upcoming memoir. She mentions witnessing her father's death, but doesn't explicitly state her involvement.
She writes, "When I was 13 years old, I helplessly watched my dear father dying from an accident, as blood was spurting everywhere. I couldn't save his life. This was the start of my personal journey in life to become a physician." It's a powerful passage, but avoids the specifics of the accident.
The New York Times points out that in the following 260 pages of her memoir, she never elaborates on the details.
It's only through these recently obtained police records that the full story has come to light, adding another layer to her narrative.
So we have this young girl who experiences this horrific tragedy and chooses to dedicate her life to saving others. Now, years later, she's been nominated for one of the highest healthcare positions in the country.
It's a compelling narrative, and one that raises questions about how this experience might shape her approach to the Surgeon General role, particularly when it comes to issues like gun violence.
Right, because for her, this isn't just an abstract policy debate. It's deeply personal.
And it's particularly relevant considering that the current Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, has declared gun violence a public health crisis.
Wow. So we have this national conversation about gun violence as a public health issue, and now a nominee with this profound personal connection to the issue.
It's a unique situation, and it begs the question, how will this personal experience inform her stance on this complex and often politicized topic?
That's the question we're going to explore further, but before we get into that, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
What's fascinating here is how this situation brings up the broader question of how personal experiences, especially traumatic ones, influence a person's professional life.
It's one thing to study medicine, to learn about diseases and treatments from textbooks, but it's another thing entirely to have lived through a life-altering event that directly relates to your field.
Exactly. It's almost like having a whole other layer of understanding, a depth of empathy that comes from firsthand experience.
So how do you think that might play out in Nesheiwat's approach to the Surgeon General role, where they're talking about a position that deals with a wide range of public health issues, not just gun violence?
Absolutely. And that's what makes this so intriguing. Will this experience lead her to prioritize certain issues over others? Will it shape her perspective on prevention strategies, on community outreach, on the emotional and psychological impacts of trauma? These are all important questions to consider.
So we can't just assume that because she's experienced this kind of loss, she'll automatically become a staunch advocate for gun control or any specific policy for that matter.
Right. It's much more nuanced than that. Her experience could just as easily lead her to focus on other areas of public health, like mental health awareness or promoting access to healthcare in underserved communities.
Or maybe and this is just a thought, maybe she'll see this as an opportunity to bridge the divide between different viewpoints on gun control, to bring a more personal, less politically charged perspective to the conversation.
That's a really interesting possibility. Her personal story could humanize the issue in a way that statistics and policy debates often fail to do.
Because, let's be honest, gun control is a highly politicized issue,
Hmm.
but when you have someone who's lived through the tragedy of gun violence, it kind of cuts through the noise, you
Yeah.
know?
It forces people to confront the human cost of these debates, which can often get lost in the rhetoric.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about Dr. Nesheiwat's past and how it might influence her future actions as Surgeon General?
Well, for one thing, it highlights the importance of understanding the individuals behind the policies. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract debates, but ultimately it's people, real people with their own unique experiences and perspectives who are making decisions that affect our lives.
And in this case, we have someone with a particularly powerful and relevant personal story, one that directly intersects with a major public health issue.
Exactly, and that story has the potential to shape her priorities, her policies, and ultimately her impact on the health and well-being of the nation. It's something we should all be aware of as her nomination moves forward.
It's also a reminder that even in positions of great power and authority, personal experiences matter. They shape who we are, how we see the world, and how we approach the challenges we face.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to those stories, to try to understand the forces that have shaped the individuals who hold these positions.
Okay, so we've talked about the incident itself. We've explored Nesheiwat's motivations for becoming a doctor, and we've touched on the potential implications of her past on her future role as Surgeon General.
But there's one more piece to this puzzle that we need to address before we can fully understand the complexities of this situation.
You're talking about Dr. Nesheiwat's family, specifically her sisters and their connections to President-elect Trump.
Right, exactly. It's not just her personal story that makes this situation interesting. It's also the web of political connections that surrounds her.
It's almost like a subplot in this whole narrative. So who are these sisters, and what kind of influence do they have?
Well, her older sister Julia is a former Homeland Security advisor to President-elect Trump.
Whoa, okay, so we're not just talking about someone who's tangentially connected to the administration. This is someone with direct access to the president-elect.
That's right. And to make things even more interesting, Julia's husband is House Representative Michael Waltz, who Trump has said will be his national security advisor.
Okay, now it's starting to feel like one of those political dramas where everyone's connected to everyone else.
It does, doesn't it? And then we have the younger sister Jacqueline, who's a former fashion model, and the wife of Scott Stapp, the lead singer of the rock band Creed,
Would Crete, like, with arms wide open for...
the one and only.
Okay.
So as you can see, there's a mix of political influence and pop culture fame within this family.
Yeah, it's almost too much to process. So what does this all mean? Are we supposed to read something into these connections?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's certainly something to be aware of, but it's impossible to say for sure what, if any, impact these connections might have on Dr. Nesheiwat's role as Surgeon General.
Right, we don't want to jump to conclusions or indulge in conspiracy theories.
Exactly. But it's worth noting that these connections do exist, and they add another layer of complexity to an already fascinating story.
Okay, so we have this personal tragedy, this dedication to medicine, and now this web of political connections. It's like a recipe for a compelling and potentially controversial tenure as Surgeon General.
It certainly has all the ingredients, and it raises a lot of questions about how these different aspects of her life will intersect and influence her decisions. But I think that's a conversation for part 2 of this deep dive.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground already, and we don't want to overwhelm you with information all at once.
Right. We want to give you time to process everything we've discussed so far. So for now, just sit back, relax, and let all this sink in. We'll be back soon with part 2.
Until then, keep those brains buzzing.
Yeah. Welcome back to part 2 of our deep dive into Dr. Janette Nesheiwat's story.
We left off talking about her family's political connections and how those might play into her role as Surgeon General should she be confirmed.
It's certainly something to think about. Having family members in key positions within the administration could potentially give her more access and influence.
But it could also lead to more scrutiny, with people asking whether her decisions are based on public health expertise or political considerations.
Absolutely a double-edged sword, but let's not get ahead of ourselves before we speculate on potential scenarios. Let's bring it back to the main question we're looking at today.
How might Dr. Nesheiwat's personal experience with her father's accidental shooting death shape her approach to the Surgeon General role, especially in the context of the current debate on gun violence?
Now, we can't know for sure how her experience will translate into policy or action,
Of course, not trying to predict the future or put words in her mouth.
but we can look at some past surgeons general who faced personal tragedies and how those experiences might have influenced their work.
That's a great point. Are there any examples that come to mind?
One is Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was Surgeon General under President Reagan.
Yep.
Dr. Koop was a pediatric surgeon who lost a young daughter to a heart defect.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Did that influence his work as Surgeon General?
It really seemed to shape how he approached certain issues. He became a strong advocate for organ donation, for instance.
That makes sense. Turning personal tragedy into a way to help others.
Exactly. Another example is Dr. David Satcher, who served under Presidents Clinton and Bush.
Okay.
Dr. Satcher grew up in poverty and saw the differences in healthcare access firsthand.
So he brought a unique perspective to the role, one based on his own experiences with these systemic issues.
Exactly. And his work really focused on dealing with health disparities and promoting health equity.
These examples show how personal experiences, both good and bad, can really shape a Surgeon General's priorities and approach to public health.
It adds a layer of complexity and a human element to the role, reminding us that these aren't just figureheads or political appointees, but real people with their own stories and motivations.
And in Dr. Nesheiwat's case, her story is especially relevant to the ongoing debate about gun violence.
It raises questions about how this tragedy might inform her views on this issue. Will she be more likely to support stricter gun control? Or will she focus on other aspects like mental health or responsible gun ownership?
Those are all valid points, and we won't know for sure until we see what she does and hear what she says if she's confirmed.
But it's important to consider the possible impact of her personal experience. It wouldn't make sense to think it won't affect how she deals with this issue.
Right, and it's something we should all be aware of as we follow her journey and look at what she does.
Now let's switch gears for a minute and talk about the specific challenges she might face in addressing gun violence as Surgeon General.
Okay, what are some of the main hurdles she might encounter?
Well, first of all, gun violence is a very politicized topic in the United States. There are very strong opinions on both sides of the debate, so it's hard to find common ground.
It's true. It seems like any attempt to address gun violence, no matter how it's done, is met with pushback from one side or the other.
Exactly, and this makes it hard to put evidence-based solutions into practice. The debate often gets stuck on ideology instead of focusing on what could actually save lives.
So how could Dr. Nesheiwat deal with this, given her personal connection to the issue?
Well, one way is she could use her own story to make the issue more human and appeal to people on both sides.
It's interesting using her experience to connect with people on an emotional level instead of just using statistics and policy arguments.
Right, by sharing her story, she could maybe create a space for more thoughtful and productive conversations about gun violence.
It could also help to take some of the political charge out of the issue by focusing on the shared goal of preventing future tragedies.
That's the hope anyway. Of course, there's no guarantee this would work.
Right. Some people might see it as trying to use her personal tragedy for political gain.
And others might just be too stuck in their own beliefs to be swayed no matter how powerful a story is.
So it's a risky move, but it could have big rewards if it's done right.
It's also important to remember that the Surgeon General mostly advises they don't have the power to make laws or policies on their own.
So even if Dr. Nesheiwat takes a strong stance on gun violence, her ability to make change happen depends on the political climate and what lawmakers do.
True, but the Surgeon General's platform can still be powerful for raising awareness, influencing public opinion, and advocating for solutions based on evidence.
They can use their position to educate the public, bust myths, and help people understand the issue better.
Exactly, and by doing that, they can help create a more informed and involved public, which is key for making real progress on any complex issue, especially one as controversial as gun violence.
So even if Dr. Nesheiwat can't directly control policy, she can still have a big impact on how we talk about gun violence nationwide.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to pay attention to what she says and does if she's confirmed, to see how her personal experience might influence her approach to this really important topic.
It's a fascinating look at how personal experience, public policy, and storytelling all come together.
And it raises a lot of important questions about what the Surgeon General does, the challenges of tackling gun violence in a divided society, and the potential for personal stories to bridge those divisions and lead to change.
This has given me a lot to think about. What are your main takeaways so far?
Well, for me, it's a reminder that the people in these powerful positions aren't just names or faces. They're real people with complicated histories and experiences that shape how they see the world and deal with the challenges they face.
And those experiences can really affect their decisions and actions, which in turn affect all of us.
It's also a reminder that even with huge challenges like gun violence, there's always hope for progress.
Whether it's through policy changes, new technology, or changes in how society thinks we can't give up on finding solutions.
And sometimes the most powerful push for change can come from unexpected places, like the personal story of someone who saw a tragedy and chose to dedicate their life to helping others.
It's like even in the darkest times, there's always some light and hope to hold on to. But before we get too deep, let's get back to the practical side of Dr. Nesheiwat's possible time as Surgeon General.
Right. We still have a few more things to cover, like President-elect Trump's statement when he announced her nomination.
He said Dr. Nesheiwat will play a pivotal role in making America healthy again. It's a catchy slogan, but what does it really mean when we think about what she might do?
That's a great question, and I think it's one worth exploring more deeply. So let's take a break here and pick this up in part 3 of our deep dive.
Sounds good. We'll see you back here soon for the final part. Until then, keep those minds curious. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Dr. Janette Nesheiwat's story.
We've covered a lot from that tragic incident to her family's political connections.
And now let's look at that statement from President-elect Trump. Dr. Nesheiwat will play a pivotal role in making America healthy again.
A powerful slogan for sure, but what does it actually mean?
Yeah, what does making America healthy again really mean, like practically? And how might Dr. Nesheiwat see that, given her own experiences?
Well, remember, the Surgeon General doesn't make laws or control funding.
So they can't just make healthcare affordable for everyone or get rid of diseases.
Right. Their role is more about guidance. They're like the nation's doctor giving advice based on the evidence.
But it's up to lawmakers to actually do something with that advice.
Exactly. And that's where the challenge is turning talk into action, especially in healthcare, which is so complicated.
So how might Dr. Nesheiwat deal with this? What are some areas she might focus on if she becomes Surgeon General?
Well, there are a few things that stand out based on her background.
Okay, what are you thinking?
First, she could focus on the opioid epidemic, which has hit communities hard all over the country.
That's a big one for sure. There's so many opioid-related deaths now.
And it needs a lot of different approaches: prevention, treatment, law enforcement, harm reduction.
It would be interesting to see how her experience with trauma might affect how she approaches this.
Another focus could be mental health. We talked about how her experience might make her aware of the effects of trauma.
And mental health is often ignored or seen as a bad thing, even though it's so important for well-being.
Exactly. And people are realizing that we need to put more resources into mental health services and support.
So she could use her position to advocate for more funding, better access to care, and less stigma around mental illness.
Another possibility is childhood obesity, which has been growing for years and has big consequences for health in the long run.
And it's connected to so many things like diet, exercise, socioeconomic status, access to healthy food.
Right, it's a complex issue that needs a big picture approach, and the Surgeon General can help by raising awareness, promoting healthy habits, and supporting policies that encourage healthy choices.
Of course, these are just a few examples. The Surgeon General's job covers a lot of public health issues.
From infectious diseases to the environment to health disparities, there are plenty of challenges.
So Dr. Nesheiwat's priorities will depend on what she thinks making America healthy again means.
And her success will depend on whether she can work within the political system, build agreement, and communicate her message to the public.
It's a big job, but she seems ready for it.
And we'll be watching.
So to wrap up this deep dive, here's a final question to think about.
How might Dr. Nesheiwat's unique experiences, both the tragic and the positive ones, shape her policies if she's confirmed?
Could they lead to a more personal perspective on some issues? Will she focus on things that connect to her own story? Or will she take a broader approach?
We can't know for sure, but these are good questions to consider as we follow her journey and see what she does.
And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. As things move forward with her nomination, we can engage with her ideas, question her assumptions, and hold her accountable.
It's up to all of us to stay informed, get involved, and care about the future of public health.
Because making America healthy again is something we all have to work on together.
So let's keep talking, keep asking questions, and keep working for a healthier and fairer future for everyone.
This has been You Talk, We Listen, brought to you by the OtisWho Network. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And until next time, keep those brains buzzing.